how we understand our environment and our actions. It cooperates with others to create collective gestures and patterns. As herds, we originally defined the dependence we have of each other for our coexistence. To simulate this intellectual, emotional, and functional collective dependence mathematically is yet to be done. When observing today's crowd simulations, we see subjects, agents in organized patterns, correctly negotiating space and others. The cooperation is impeccable. We are not impeccable. The algorithms programming the ideal digital crowd do not encompass our defaults. On the contrary, they use default settings to reproduce us virtually. We cannot but understand the representation of us as crowds through our own physical experience and senses. When we enter a crowd, we encounter people, each with their smell, aura, personality, and history. The crowd is not firstly defined by its dynamics, but by its people.
So, Anna Ådahl, who last year finished her PhD on digitized, on the title is Inside the Post-Digital Crowd. So I want to begin by asking you, why is it called post-digital? You seem to take a certain distance already here in the title towards the very term digital.
So the post-digital term, which is quite established by now, and I would even, for me, think that we're a bit beyond it, but the post-digital is when it's just a phenomenon of how the digital is sort of imbued in everything, how we're all used to it, and at a certain point we're not so mesmerized by what it can do. It's just part of everyday life and everyday things.
No. You have a footnote where you say that people are taking also, I mean, of course, obviously in one sense it's already immersed everywhere, but on the other hand also there's a certain distance towards it. We feel more suspicious of the digital and all the promises that it once held.
I think part of the post-digital term is also based on the fact that we are disenchanted, and that goes hand in hand when I talked about not being mesmerized about the promises or how it could be used and by whom and so on. Now we know that everything is much more market-oriented and so on. But I wanted to use post-digital to understand that we are in that state, in that sort of era. At the same time, today I'm more interested to use the term automation, for example, and automized. Also because there's many new technologies now, computational technologies that would use other kind of non-binary forms. So yeah, lower technologies.
Yeah. So I mean, if the post-digital crowd, so the second term is then crowd, and the thesis consists of three sections. I thought we just addressed them one after the other. It begins with the idea of the simulated crowd, where you trace the idea of the crowd from, let's say, social science from the turn of the former turn of the century, in late 1800s, early 1900s, where there was a fear of the crowd, that it would somehow be destabilizing society, that it was unruly, impossible to control. But then you trace a history of how the crowd has been theorized from the early 1900s to the present. So can you just walk us through there's a certain series of stages here when the crowd is transformed up until today, where we have a really, a different sense of the masses of the crowd. So, I mean, what has happened here?
So, I'm not against the forces of the crowd, as can be an unruly and sort of disturbing or disruptive force in a sense, but it's more the criticism about seeing the crowd as a mob.
Yeah.
And in Swedish you say pöbeln, and in French you do say la foule, which is different actually. But I think it's, I have a bit of a tendency to dislike that generalization when you see the crowd just as a unified form, and I prefer to, or I position myself as understanding that crowd as an assembly of singulars that has agency, and not just sort of a dumb mass. But that is up to debate, depending on which context that we were talking about.
No, I'm thinking
But so yeah, briefly. So I've been working a lot with the crowd for a long time and the collective behavior and so forth. And so when I started the research, started the PhD rather, I was interested in, because I've been looking at the crowds in the 30s and from the beginning, I was like, so what is the condition of the crowd today? And obviously it's the digital, the computational condition that we are all in and that the crowd is in. And when I refer to crowds, I refer to rather any sort of rather large group beyond that of the group. So the crowd is something where you're part of it, but you cannot, if you raise your voice, you cannot direct it in a sense. So the voice you have is more of that of the citizen and the one who can sort of, use your voice in that way.
I'm thinking you're referring to the early theorists of the crowd, like Le Bon and others, where the problem was, to some extent, that the crowd had an agency. It was dangerous. It might, as it were, the French Revolution is often a case in point, and so in some sense the evolution of the theory of the crowd, or as it was theorized in social science, was how to discipline the crowd, how to control it, and in that sense we have reached a rather high level of discipline today. So is this a continuous story of becoming more and more disciplined and somehow getting rid of the fear that the crowd would have a disruptive agency? Or
exactly.
I mean, how do you see that history?
No, but what is interesting is in this sort of in this post-digital or era of automation, if you like, is that because of the new computational technologies, you can govern and mediate crowd in a whole new manner. You can monitor and surveil it and so forth, and from the satellites into the sort of your bloodstream and inside your body through the different sort of biometric data and so forth. So all this globalized systemization, digital systemization of the body and hence the whole crowd, it's on a whole new level. And as we see now, this evolution is even more intensified. Firstly, because of the pandemic, where everybody were the leap in the sort of evolution of the digital technologies and the digitization of everyday life and of everybody has been heightened and intensified. But in the same time, we always have to remember that from the satellites from far above, having the sort of bigger overlook to the sort of how our sort of earbuds and phones sort of and other kind of technologies, scanning technologies goes inside our bodies.
So it's in some sense it's no discipline ranging from the more general level down to the most minute level. So it's a history of increasing control and homogenization, as it were. But you say also that for you the crowd should not be perceived as as it were, statistical mass of equals, but more like a collection of singularities. So I mean, jumping to the end of your book, you see that one of the stakes in your text is how the crowd can have an agency. I mean, how, because of course this disciplining is also part of some kind of process of political neutralization. So do you see any possibilities? I mean, as I said, the story you tell is a bit a somber one. It gets more and more disciplined. But are there potentials for thinking the crowd in a different sense?
I think what I did when I wrote the PhD is to sort of trying to map and analyze and study how those new technologies are operating the crowd, and from that understanding see what kind of agency that can emerge, or what of the agency you can understand. So basically, if we're going to talk about that, it's about understanding the different sort of strategies and mechanisms that are operated on the crowds through those technologies. And so my interest has been on first also finding a sort of representation and mediation of that sort of digitized automated crowd. And I was interested then to look at the simulation. So you can find crowd simulation softwares where you can produce crowds, and that whole sort of vocabulary and grammar that these softwares uses, and the aesthetics of those crowd agents, human crowd agents, that you can use and create, and also use, you can get the default one, and what all the sort of, how do you say, embedded identity or aesthetics that comes with that tells us quite a lot. And I was interested in sort of focusing on that simulated crowd agent and crowds, and then putting that into parallel with the sort of organic physical crowd, and how that crowd is operated by the digital technologies, from the surveillance tracking, multi-tracking, and the self-tracking that we do through our phones and when we use. And there, so in those two processes, in, for example, the crowd simulation, you can use a default agent, so you can produce a default crowd. That's sort of a simplified and sort of easy manner of creating a crowd. And so how does that default crowd look like? And at the same time, as you said, this homogenization that occurs when you have to operate millions of people through the different sort of the computational technologies. There's also embedded sort of default settings that we're operating every day. I mean, we all are used to like cookies or something. And all these sort of default setting and options actually is that when you use them, or when you sort of, because it sort of is a user-friendly, it's easier, a more comfortable way to get by when you're using this the softwares and technologies, that's when the data is harvested.
Yeah, because that's the topic of the second part, this kind of default crowd or default subject, this kind of generic individual that exists in crowd simulations. So I was thinking that here, there's obviously a difference or a certain tension between the physical and the, let's call it the digital or the computational. In some sense, you can say that people's behavior will become like the automated, digitized version. On the other, that it somehow mimics the simulation. How do you perceive this? I don't know if dialectic is right, but how do you perceive this relation between how we simulate crowd behavior, which obviously predicated upon this idea of the default subject, the default and generic person, and the actual physical world where people still are individuals in a very individual sense. I mean, do you see any danger here that we will, I mean, it's a kind of underlying theme, I think, in your text, that we will eventually more and more perceive the real world as becoming modeled on this, as it were, default world?
But we're part of all those sort of default modes the whole time. And there's a general understanding that we know that the sort of the computational technologies from apps, software, whatever, is homogenizing, standardizing our behavior on a global scale. And that's no news. But I was interested in, because the crowd agent, the crowd simulation, it's not that, it's a digital character that is not based on an individual or human body, in the sense that it's been capturing the human body and sort of, and then directly translating it into a character that you can find in, for example, the main characters in films, or even in computer games. You can sometimes, they model it on a real person or an organic physical person. So I was interested in the crowd simulation because they are used to create that crowd in the background, the one that's supposed to be just in the periphery, and that it's not the main character, doesn't have some kind of sort of power, so to say, or agency in that manner. And also they are purely produced digitally. They're not sort of mapped on from a physical body, as I just said. And so how does this sort of totally mathematically digital computational body look like this programmed body in that sense, because that's what it is. So that's where my interest was, about how do you perceive a mathematic programmed body. It
looks like the Vitruvian body, right? You said somewhere, the guy standing with his arms.
So what is interesting is, I come back to this character with the arms standing out like this, because when you go into the crowd simulation and you're going to program the behavior of the character, it always did the default sort of posture before being programmed, whether it's like available to be programmed, is with that sort of T-pose, as it's called. So I think the T-pose is very interesting, because that's right before we're going to program
It's an Anthony Gormley sculpture. Sorry, Anthony. For
Yeah,
that.
so it's a recurrent image in the films and in other works I've done, but so and it has this sort of represented availability that you make your body available to be programmed and so forth. So it becomes, I mean, it's a bit metaphorical in that sense to use that sort of to understand, to have an image or sort of a mediation of that sort of digitized body. And then I draw this parallel to understand, and so I was really interested also by those default characters that you can use. So because they come with all the aesthetics that is programmed when creating the software and so forth. So there's also this idea about what the embedded aesthetics that you appropriate and that you then use within the work, and also that kind of discussion that we're not going to have right now. And where was I? So what is this default character? Yeah. So it's, in general terms, is a character that's based on a sort of average-based system or statistic, if you like, but it's not an average man. It's a character, because it's usually a white male, and that's also another kind of problem. So what is actually is informed by those sort of average statistics, but it is a default produced character. So if you use a default produced character, then of course that generates a default crowd. And so then I draw this parallel to how we are organized by those technologies in our everyday life, standardized gestures that you can recognize throughout the entire globe in that sense, and also how all those default options and settings that we use or that we accept when we are online is also abbreviating and also sort of standardizing a certain kind of online gestures, and at the same time, and what is important there is that it's also all this data that is sort of harvested and gathered at the moment that when we use those shortcuts.
So I mean, this is not just theory; this is in practice-based research, which means that your own work is involved, and that comes in here in the second part. Because I mean, one other aspect of this dialectical tension or translation between the computation and the real is actually your artworks. I mean, which are physical. There are films and performances and sculptures, and there are several pieces that you made in 2018 and a couple of years onward that relate directly to your research. And you just described some of these works. I mean, how you went about to I wouldn't use the word translate, maybe, but to articulate those
transmediate
problems. Transmediate is that word? Okay, that's a good word. But how did you transmediate those ideas into physical reality?
So it's not necessarily that I'm thinking about things theoretically, or it's very much a dialogue that's in constant dialogue that sort of nurture the practice and then nurture my theoretical approach and then back to the practice. So it has this sort of, it's a dialogue going on. And so the first part also of the thesis, which is or the second chapter if you like, which just addresses default and those default characters and crowds. So in 2018 I made this exhibition where I really was direct focus on this default character. And there's a film that is called The Simulated Crowds, which addresses this more in a more sort of overarching kind of essay film that takes in also this parallel I've been drawing between the digital simulated body and the virtual body and then the physical sort of digitized programmed real body of crowds and individuals. And so what happens is that what I referred to earlier, this default character is part of that periphery that's supposed to be not in focus and doesn't have any sort of power or authority. I made, for example, these busts. So it was about focusing on the people of the background and giving them this, making those busts in 3D. image 3D printing modes that I can come back to, and actually position them as representatives or as sort of becomes a default anonymous person as authority in the space, and giving them some kind of agency in the sense. But when you, and of course, all these technologies evolve as we speak. So it is also a marking in time. That's when I did those busts or when I made the film at that time, it's about at that precise moment. So it's always a mark in time and history. And so those busts, when you use, then I took this a small character and then we blown up to the sort of life size and printed out in polyurethane, so in plastic. And then I was interested in printing in clay. It's quite a large format, which is quite complicated. So we managed to do that with RISE, as a research institute in north of Sweden. And so those two different materials, the clay that was, you can see, was printed out this way, as you would take a toothpaste anyway. And with time, it withers and crackles. So it will sort of wither with time. And it, in that sense, it represents how all these technologies also disappears as you speak, or evolve as you speak. So the former version of it has no, it's ubiquitous. I mean, it doesn't have any sense, or it only as historical archival sort of reference. And then the plastic is like, it has this more permanent. And on purpose, I was usually when you 3D print, then manually you come and sort of clean it up in a sense, or aesthetically sort of transform it to look appealing for some. But I was very much interested in keeping all the traces of the printing head and this whole sort of computational process that it's been, these busts has been produced through. And so you can see all the markings and all that. And at the same time I was also interested because then it also, every bust that you produce will have its individual and unique markings. So they become also, even though digitally reproduced or technically reproduced, there is some kind of uniqueness to them.
But there are sculptures and there's a performance and there's films. I mean, how do you see them as various takes on the same problem, or does it signal something else when you move from physical sculptures to film?
I mean, sometimes because I work I put my work and the artwork for the purpose of within the context of research and in a more academic setting. It does have a purpose of what kind of knowledge it produces and how you experience that narrative. And sometimes I used to call it experience knowledge, because you have multiple experiences that are sensorial or physical, and so it's, for example, there's a performance where you see four, I think it's four performers that where we've been studying exactly the digital crowd agent and then just really translating it into space. And at the same time, the whole art space I was marking on the floor is actually the same one you find in the crowd simulation program, where it's like, this is where you accelerate, this is where you stop, this is, so the whole space also became inside that software of how how these agents are programmed. So then transmitting, going from one sort of this digital medium into the physical body, and also with this performance, there were professional dancers that has that kind of experience.
Because I mean, this performance is called either or, right? Something like that.
So when you program the digital agent in a crowd simulation, and in many programs, it's like you do this and this or this and this. So it's and or, and so it goes on. So that was the title of the piece. And talking about, because now we're focusing on the research part that these works are sort of part of, it's also important for me that when I do the artwork, even in relationship to the research, they are really autonomous. That the autonomy of the art and the artworks are preserved and not sort of adapted. So you can sort of very much experience it
So
that
it was
way.
an interesting thing here, because when you then not translate but transmediate the simulated crowd structures to physical bodies. I mean, these are professional dancers, as you write. They have obviously a very strong capacity for controlling their body and movement. Does it add something? I mean, what is added when you actually transmediate that into a physical body that moves in your same space? Is there something? I mean, I guess there's a certain sense of estrangement when you see a physical person behaving in this and or either or version. I mean, what is added here? Is there some kind of eerie sense of the uncanny or the
yeah, I was very interested because in the crowd simulation software, when you program the crowd agents to move about and the behavior and so, it's mostly about avoiding things.
Yeah.
And within the program you avoid objects or edges or walls as much as you avoid other agents. So what happens when you translate that kind of behavior into the space, and on top of it, when we did the performance during the opening, there was quite a lot of people that was in the same space with those dancers performing, is that they're just avoiding you or their other fellow agents as much as they will avoid sort of a plinth or any object in space. So it becomes this very sort of robot-like, non-human behavior in that sense, that it's just about, you just have to avoid everybody to just go to target. And I thought that was one of the interesting aspects. And at the same time, it's like, some comment was like, oh, but they're just acting like robots.
The actors move from one goal to the next. So you can move the goals around as you like to define the crowd's flow. After actors reach their final goal, they just generally keep moving around it, unless you tell them to do something else.
So it was more of a processual experiment to sort of, that was quite the sort of literal study in a way, to just understand these digital programmed bodies in human, sort of going forth and back a bit like that, back into the human.
If we move on to the third part of the work here, which is called flow or power, flow, power. It's about power and flow. So one of the key terms that always recurs in this kind of discourse is flow, that things in flow, being in motion. You have a whole interesting discussion of the concept of flow and how that signals different things in this kind of discourse. So flow, why flow? What is flow?
So when it comes from multiple sources, but in the beginning I default, and I'm still interested by this default term, because I think it's a strategy and mechanism, and it's a term that sort of says a lot about all the technologies, however much they are evolving. I mean, even if you look at the recent technologies of ChatGPT, there is an average and default embedded in some of those images, but this is changing as we speak in different directions. But so when I talked earlier about those agents always avoiding anything, and why they had to avoid to continue to be, so it's about always being in the flow of movement, flow of evolution, flow of progress in a sense. So I was interested, I was like, originally I had the hunch, what is this flow thing? This is more of a strategy and term that's linked to the sort of politics of these crowds and the dynamics, of course. So it's about, so I was interested in the whole sort of contemporary concept. So instead of sort of focusing on the flow as you will find a dictionary, sort of much more linked only to liquidity and fluids, states, I was interested in the flow in the more sort of urban slang, where you talk, oh, I got flow, then Misha, I got money, or I'm in the flow, I'm super productive, or I got flow, it's like good things are happening right now. And this has been sort of appropriated and sort of, I would say, hijacked by our consumer society. When, you know, this state of flow has been sort of monetized, because flow is why we have workflow, you're very productive. Then it's also the performativity of that. You're in a performance mode, so that's a good flow. And then in the same time, to sort of keep up these productive and performative modes, of course, that's how you also earn money. So you get that kind of flow. And then everybody's sort of exhausted of doing all this. And then what do? Then you go into the yoga flow, and then the meditative state flow, and so. But sometimes in the end, it's just sort of a quick remedy to be able to go back into the flow of production. So suddenly you would just see that term flow everywhere you would look, especially in all new kind of businesses and enterprises and so on. And at the so I think that was one of the interests that I had in flow. And there's also something else there which was interesting. Yeah, anyway.
No, if I can add something, I mean, it's interesting if one looks at the concept of flow, it goes back, I mean, it has a long history in philosophy, etc. But I mean, I think one of the key moments, if one translates it into certain spatial terms, is early modernist architecture. You know, there's this great book by Siegfried Giedion, who was one of the key players in the early modernist movement, and he had this book called Building in France. Where he says that if we look at any city, it looks at a railway station. You look at this is like 1928 railway station. Where are the walls? Where are all these solid? There are no solid elements. It's an open structure. What you see is a flow of flux of motion, Bewegungsstrom. And architecture is not about creating fixed boundaries, but to channel, create conduits for this stream of movement, which is Strom.
And do not resist time, change and death. For the only real problematic form of death is rigidity and resistance to change. Now and forever flowing, follow each other.
Crowd management is very much based on always sort of capacitate the kind of flow, especially of bodies in sort of crowded spaces.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons I've been filming quite a lot in the subway, in the tunnelbana, because I was interested in a whole systemized environment which is there to keep the human flow, or not the human, but the flow of people within that vicinity. And so it's like an apparatus, it's like a whole system which is so clear in its purpose of, and also that's why I'm interested in the walkways, and it's like always being the constant flow. And I think that's also linked to my interest of crowds and how crowds are managed. I lived in London for a short while, and if you go, for example, to the Tower and see the jewels, they have an amazing crowd management of this kind of continuous flow where you use in physical space some kind of distractions, and then when you arrive at the jewels at the center, after being in sort of guided through a labyrinth with your peer, like with other people, you arrive at the jewels, and there you put on a walkway, and it's like, anyway, it doesn't have much to do with this, but it sort of tells us very much how. But I mean, for crowd management and for security, the flow and the movement of people to be a good flow, that's something else, because that has a security purpose to preserve life. It taps onto that, but in general, my interest for flow is just tapping into all these natural flows. That is originally the yoga, which was about sort of more, or not yoga, but more the flow. I think it's the, if I remember well, sort of Tibetan or a Buddhist sort of understanding of being together with others and empathic relationships. And then it's been sort of appropriated in the 90s by this whole new wave, and then turning into the more consumerist yoga versions that we have, that we can find online. And in the film, there's also, I was interested. Yeah, sorry.
I was not going to ask, there's a film connected to this third part, which is
Power
called
of Flow.
The Power of Flow, or
The Flow of Power.
The Flow of Power. So I was wondering, is this a tension between two takes, or is it just an inversion of the title? Is there a flow of power and a power of flow? Are these different?
Yeah.
How do you connect the two?
Because it is, when we talk about how the flow of power, it's like how you can see that you're using that kind of term flow and that sort of in this more sort of market-oriented using bodies and people to be productive, performative, and so on, and fitting into that kind of flow. And at the same time, you have the power of flow, which is that it can be interpreted in several ways. And like, can you reclaim that flow, or what kind of power is it in? I mean, there's original natural flows and so forth. And are there other flows that can be created and be disruptive? As I refer to, we can create sort of kind of disturbance and so forth. How can you disrupt this flow? And so there's other attempts of imagining how this sort of monetized flow can be sort of met or resisted or disrupted. I don't know.
Coming back to the first thing I asked was whether there is an agency of the crowd that can still be disruptive, or whether the simulated crowd management is everything we have. I'm thinking about a reference you don't have in the book. I don't think so anyway. I mean, in the early stages of the internet world, to say it like that, you have not the crowd but the multitude. You remember Empire by Antonio Negri and Michael Hart. There was this idea that, not so much based in digital technology, but it was hinted at that this new world would create, new links, new transversal communities. You had the idea of general intelligence about Paolo Virno and others in the Italian movement. There was all these things that was somehow, I would say, fantasizing about the fact that there would be new political subjects emerging because of the new technological environment.
Yeah, the peer-to-peer based systems.
Yeah.
So,
but has that evaporated today? I would say largely it has, but I mean, what do you say about that?
I think that kind of optimism that was that what the internet could provide as a sort of connection between people and this peer-to-peer based systems, as we have seen, most of the internet has been market-based, and sort of, so it's a bit a reality that we're in, which is a bit depressing. But I think now, after this, the PhD, I'm now working on this research project with Stefan Jonsson, which is called Collective Agency in an Era of Authoritarian Automation. So basically, this is what we're looking into. And so I'm not going to say much more, but basically there is what kind of collective agency, and an extension of that, what kind of resistance or new alternatives, sort of trying to maybe tap into that optimism that we have all, or whatever you can call it, that we've all sort of given up on, or that we can't. Is there a possibility to sort of reimagine that somehow?
Yeah.
And because there are things happening, and it's about a mobilization that goes in parallel and beyond, or not in parallel, but on the outside, or on the side of this sort of market, sort of defy big tech, sort of monopolistic situation that we're in. Are we finishing that?
I think so.